Hello everybody, welcome back for question and answer video part 4. Today is July 31st, 2024, and I am Iain Bryson, author of I Love You Like One, a letter to my daughter abducted by a cult. Today I'm with my beautiful and highly talented wife, Emily Bryson, and I'll let her introduce herself and the topic we're going to discuss.
Hey everyone, my name is Emily, and I'm happy to be here today for this video because the topic that we're looking at is what is the red herring and why did it work? So, the red herring is a theme throughout the book. It's on the cover of the book with a sword piercing through it, the sword of truth piercing through it because Iain is exposing the truth, destroying the red herring. So first of all, what is a red herring? I have a definition here. It's a quote from the book. So Grammarly defines a red herring as a rhetorical device that diverts attention from the topic at hand. It is a tool used in an argument. The red herring fallacy causes a distraction in an argument that draws attention off topic. Because of this, a red herring is a type of logical fallacy. A red herring is a way for a speaker to win an argument by bringing up a matter that is irrelevant to the main issue. So I never heard of this term before I met Iain. So in his story, his first wife told him, "My dad has created a red herring. Your drug, psychological, and criminal histories are going to be used against you, so no one will believe you." So there is a story about Iain that he is the abuser and that his first wife and daughter escaped for their lives, and so many people have believed this because they have listened to his first wife. The truth is important. Is Iain the abuser, or is there a cult in Poland? Those are the two stories that are being told, and only one of them is true. So I have known and been very close with Iain for 7 years. I fell in love with him. He's my best friend. I know him better than anyone in the whole world because I listen and I research what he's talking about. And he opened my eyes to the world of evil, of ritual abuse, that it is very real, that mind control is real. But he also opened my eyes to the reality of good and love and Jesus Christ, our Savior. So Iain has changed my life dramatically for the better, and I'm blessed to be on this journey with him. So I want to dive right into this topic of the red herring and kind of chronologically what happened in the story. The first time that you heard about the red herring from your first wife was in the last 3 weeks you were together when she was threatening to take your daughter away. So what was the lead up to that? I know you were apart for 3 months while you were in the US looking for housing and work because you wanted to move there together as a family. So what was it like in your home before you were apart for those 3 months? I think we should start there.
So, my first wife and I had just cycled out of one of her down periods where she had returned from Poland after Easter 2010, and said she hated me, and she had no communication with me, refused to talk to me, was acting like a woman who had been abused upon her return from Poland. And then we cycled out of that back to being on top of the world, and we were doing wonderful. And I was under the impression that those problems were healed, but I was still a little bit weary and didn't want to be alone anymore. So we decided we'd move back to the United States. We filed her paperwork for her visa, and we went on a trip to Leiden, stayed at the Mayflower Hotel, and just were having wonderful times as a family. And then she begged me not to leave. She told me she was afraid we would never get back what we had. She asked me to contact my cousin in the FBI to see if he could expedite her visa. And she just plain begged me all the way up until I left to go on the plane to not leave, with a fear that I thought was irrational.
Yeah. That makes me so sad in hindsight that she was begging you not to leave. Do you think that she knew something was going to happen so that you really wouldn't get back the happy family that you had?
So it's hard for me to say exactly what she knew, but I mean, I think by how things were with us just being a happy, healthy family, and spending time going out to the parks and around the city and dancing together and cooking and reading to our daughter. Um, and the fear that she had, whether she could place exactly where that fear was coming from or whether it was more general, that's something that I'll have to ask her someday. But I think that she had a genuine fear that something was going to happen that would destroy what we had.
Yeah. So, while you were apart for the 3 months, how was your communication? What was that like? Were there any indications that things were going wrong or that she wasn't okay?
So we communicated every day, often multiple times a day, on Skype, through emails, through text messages, and all of the communications that we had were her telling her that she loved me and missed me and couldn't wait till we were back together. Um, on November 18th, 2010, she wrote that she'd been sitting at the computer reading and waiting for me. She says, I love you more than I will ever be able to express during our lifetime. I miss you, and the thought of being in your arms soon is the only thing that keeps me going. I love you some more. Night, night, Agata. On December 5th, she wrote, Ian, hey, sweetie, I've been out with Adele playing in the snow. But when I got back, my tummy started to feel funny, and I think I have a stomach flu. I love you from all of my heart, and you are my everything. Then on December 8th, the day before we met back up at our home in The Hague, she wrote, can't wait to be home tomorrow. Love you loads and loads. Kisses, your girls, Agata. So all of the communication from our emails is in the book, and it all sounds like that. Now, I did have some indication in the Skype messages and on the phone conversations that frightened me. It didn't seem like she was holding up as well as I thought she would. She was constantly expressing to me that she was ill with something, and there were at least a couple times where I contemplated calling off this trip, calling off the move to the United States temporarily, and just meeting back at The Hague so I could reassess and make sure she was okay. But I pressed on just thinking, well, it won't be long and she has to be okay. Why wouldn't she be okay? She was fine when I left her, and she seems fine in these written communications. So I kind of pushed it out of the way and moved forward.
Okay, so based on these emails and your communication, your phone calls as well, she loved you so much and was excited to be back together. She didn't want to be apart, and she was just like expressing this intense amount of love for you, right?
Yeah, like I thought I was the luckiest man in the world. I I could not wait to get home to her and to our daughter. And I was I felt great while I was in Connecticut working towards finding work and a home for us because I had these girls that were waiting for me and obviously doing well and couldn't wait to see me as well. And so I when I did leave Connecticut, I rushed home with not a thought on my mind that anything could be wrong. I wrote a love letter to Agata on the train ride home. I ran home, and I could not wait to hold them in my arms and get back to where we had left off.
Yeah. Okay, so you're very excited to be home after these 3 months apart. She seems to be very excited based on her last email. And so, what happens when you show up at the doorstep of your home in The Hague?
So when I showed up, I rang the doorbell, and my first wife and our daughter came down the stairs. My first wife was holding our daughter, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. the look and the feel was horrible, and it struck me. I had a chill run down my spine, and I began to try to figure out what could be going on. So we went upstairs, and I set my daughter in front of the TV so I could talk to my first wife. And immediately I tried to hug her and kiss her, and that's when she jumped away from me and said, "You're hurting me. I hate you. I've always hated you. And I'm taking our daughter back to Poland for Christmas or New Year's."
From what you know now, why would she jump away from you if you just lovingly like touch her, give her a hug, and say ouch? Why would she do that?
Well, I think that she had been made by her abusers to actually hate me, and whether my attempt to kiss her triggered that, or whether she was already like that before I got home, something changed in between the time that she was in Poland and the time that now we're back together. And and I had seen it before. We'd gone through this cycle before, and I tried telling her, this is the same thing that happened after your last return from Poland. And how can you possibly say that you hate me? And how could me kissing you after all of those love letters be painful for you? It doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there were other scenarios of this as well, where she like shouted at you, calling you names, and like genuinely seeming like she hated you, right? Like she wasn't acting.
Right. That's like over the course of our relationship, I often confronted her on lying, because there would be instances like this where, in this instance, she says, "I hate you and I've always hated you." And that either is a lie, or she really believes that she hates me and has always hated me. And for the previous 3 months, believed that she loved me and couldn't wait back to be back together again. So I struggled with whether she's lying or whether she actually believes this. And it seemed to me that she did believe this. I couldn't wrap my head around how that could be true.
Yeah. So you got home after 3 months of being apart, and then everything just starts falling apart again. So what else happened in the last 3 weeks that you were together?
So a lot happened, and it was all a surprise to me after the 3 months of positive communication that we had, and the hope and the expectations that we had as a family, to move to the United States and to raise our daughter there, and just how she expressed her love to me. So after telling me that she hated me and always hated me, she told me that she was taking our daughter to a cult, that her family's a cult. The reason she was taking our daughter to the cult was because of mind control, that she had something like Stockholm syndrome, and that her dad had created a red herring so that no one would believe me. And I just thought that she sounded crazy. I was begging her to get help with me. I had set up several appointments with the psychologist we had both been seeing together, and he was trying to contact her. She was unresponsive to his attempts to get in contact with her. And I tried to logically explain to her why we needed help and why this didn't make sense, but it was impossible to get through to her.
Just thinking about what it was like for you in that moment, in those moments when she would turn against you. It's like this puzzle that you did not have all the pieces to, and now you have much more of them. But just thinking about you in that moment, trying to figure out what was going on, and just how confusing that was and how scary that must have been.
So I was absolutely terrified. I was telling her I was terrified. I was begging her to get help. I was trying to logically show her why we needed to get help, and I was trying to get other people to step in, like the psychologist. Um, and I was in the middle of it. I had just been apart from her for 3 months, and now I was dropped back in the middle of it, and it was overwhelming. But I also told her, I've seen this before, and you're not going to fool me this time. I'm stronger now, and I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And what you're telling me is not going to happen. And I don't even know what it is you're talking about. But there is no way that you're taking our daughter back to Poland because of what I see and what has obviously happened in Poland. It was not good.
Yeah. So share more specific things that she said regarding the red herring and the allegations against you in those last 3 weeks that you were together.
The statements that she made to me during those last 3 weeks were both repetitive and robotic. And she just kept repeating the same things over and over again. And so when I asked her what she meant by red herring, she said, your drug, criminal, and psychological histories are going to be used against you. No one's going to believe you. And she said that to me constantly. Um, the other things that she said were she called me a typical abuser. And I believe that she said that because that's how I was going to be portrayed once this all began happening. Um, I was telling her that she and our daughter both looked like they had been abused in Poland. I was begging her to go to a doctor with our daughter. I was begging her to go to the psychologist and tell the psychologist what she was telling me. I wanted our daughter to be evaluated. There was one time where I was telling her that our daughter had been abused, and she was on the bed, huddled up, curled up, and would not address my concerns. And I told her that she looked like a rape victim, and then she popped up and yelled molester at me. And I looked at her and I said, like, who is the molester? Like, who is doing this to you? What happened? And she just froze up and would not entertain my questions back to her. She just kept repeating the same things, that my drug, psychological, and criminal histories would be used against me, and no one was going to believe me, period. And that's as far as she would take it.
It's so sad. So what was your initial response or reaction to her saying that her dad had created this red herring? Did you know what a red herring was? Because I never did
So,
until you told me.
so I knew what a red herring was from reading crime stories, and authors will use a diversionary path to keep their readers in suspense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's often very hard to know what is actually happening in a well written fiction novel, because a good author can keep your mind elsewhere and give you clues that you think are more likely. So while the real story is happening and developing, and you won't see that till the end of the story, an author uses a red herring to keep his or her readers occupied and diverted from that true story.
Mm-hmm. So what was your response then in that moment when she started saying, my dad has created red herring, and that all these things were going to be used against you? What were you afraid? Like, what were you thinking that meant?
So I was afraid, but I also thought that that was ridiculous. The fact that I have a drug, criminal, psychological history, is of and was of no significance to the situation. And in my book, I'm totally open about that history of myself, and it's obvious that it's not relevant to the topic at hand. And what I told her is that I told her it's going to be obvious to anyone looking in that the problem happened in Poland, that she didn't make any sense, that I wasn't using drugs. I had no, I didn't have a criminal history, in reality, and that whatever that story was going to be easily seen through, is what I believed. So I told her that she sounded crazy, and that the problem was obviously in Poland.
Yeah. And you were trying to get help. Like, that's one of the things that stands out to me the most is you were trying to protect her because she was obviously acting very strangely and but you were also trying to get help for your family. So reaching out to the psychologist, even emails in the book, reaching out to family and friends, being like, it's happening again, explaining how crazy it was in your household at the time. So you were reaching out, and I think a typical abuser, as she called you, would try to keep that quiet, have no attention drawn to the family. But you were inviting people in. You're like, please help, and I'm terrified. So what other things did you do to try to get help?
So I told people like my best friend, a psychologist, and my mother that I was terrified. Um, I had multiple meetings with the psychologist. I went to the police and told them that she was threatening to leave the country with our daughter. And just I sent emails frequently to people like my friend and the psychologist. And for example, on December 19th, I sent an email to my friend saying, pretty crazy here, kind of like warping into another reality. The wifey is back to where she was. So I've been trying to figure that out. And my friend likened this to a phrase, what's your favorite color? As if I'm asking my first wife, what's your favorite color? And then her response to me is something like refrigerator. And that really encapsulates how crazy it was, because there was no talking to her, there was no um, rational thought happening. It was just, I'm taking our daughter back to the cult in Poland, and no one's going to believe you because of X, Y, and Z. And no further discussion is allowed or going to happen. Another email that I sent to the psychologist on December 25th, which was 2 days prior to the abduction, was, I'm thinking more and more that I'm dealing with a psychopath or antisocial personality disorder. And wow, it is terrifying. How can you continue to call something white when it is black? I am terrified to leave as she has my child's passport and I have no idea where it may be. I have text messages and emails indicating nothing is abnormal and that she loves me, up until the point I walked into the door and was hit with a barrage of expletive, which has continued until now. On December 26th, the day before the abduction, I wrote to the psychologist, I have no idea what to do and am terrified.
What your friend said regarding the situation being like, what's your favorite color refrigerator? I just think of so many different dialogues in the book with your first wife where she says things that are just so surprising and so odd that just don't make any sense, but they do when you look at it from the perspective of ritual abuse and mind control. I was thinking of when you were trying to be like 1 + 1 always equals 2. You're like, we're trying to be logical here. What has happened? Why are you like this? Like, the abuse obviously happened in Poland. And her response was 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. It depends on whose math. Like, who even thinks of that? What do you think she meant by that?
I think that she meant that, like, thinking logically wasn't the way that it necessarily had to go. That there could be the truth, and then another scenario that someone like her father could devise, which would override the truth, and that what she was saying, even though it was ridiculous and not logical and not true, that it could be made into the truth, and people could be convinced that that story was what was happening, and that people could be fooled, and that my daughter could be taken from me back to a cult in Poland, and that it didn't matter what I thought about it or knew about it, or the fact that I was even warned that she would be taken back to a cult in Poland, that it could still happen regardless of what the truth was.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That was a really good description. So back to the storyline. She told you all these things were going to happen in these last 3 weeks you were together. and then they happened. So what happened after they were abducted, and how did the red herring develop after the abduction?
So after I gave my daughter a hug, the last hug I ever got to give her, and watched her walk down the stairs, watched her mother follow her, then I called my friend and we had a conversation. And a few minutes into that conversation, I realized that what my first wife had warned me was going to happen was happening, and I sprinted to the police department. And like I don't know what the police were told, if anything, but their response to me was to not even take a formal report, to write me off and my concerns off. And and what I was telling them was, I want you to stop them from leaving the Netherlands because they're being abused in Poland, and I want an evaluation to happen here. And they didn't care what I had to say, and they were completely unwilling to help me. So that was my first inclination that another story was being propagated.
And then what did you hear from Agata after she left?
I received an email from Agata the day after they left, and the email said, Adele and I are at a shelter for abused women and children because I was afraid for my life and what Adele was going through. We couldn't stay under one roof with all the abuse. I will contact you in a few days so we can plan to meet the three of us and also to see a counselor about all of this. So that information to me was actually great considering the circumstances. What I wanted was for them to be in the Netherlands. And the fact that they were at a shelter meant that maybe a trauma specialist would be looking at them. And I knew that if a trauma specialist did look at them, then that specialist would know that I was not the perpetrator. And so as long as they were not in Poland, I was fine with this, because my only fear was that they get back to Poland at this point. I realized that we needed help, and that we had to deal with whatever issues had been happening in Poland, and that was a whole nother story. Of course, I was worried about that as well, but my only real fear was that they get back into Poland.
So she told you that they were staying in a shelter in the Netherlands for abused women, right? Do you think that they really stayed in a shelter?
I really don't know. I reached out to the shelters. I contacted a friend who was married to a Dutch woman, because I thought maybe he would have some insight into how things worked in the Netherlands. And he indicated to me that the shelters were legally obliged to tell the father or the mother, whoever was the left behind parent, that the child was in a shelter, but they didn't have to give you the address of the shelter. So that concerned me, because none of the shelters were responding to me. Nobody was telling me where they were or if they were still in the country. So I hoped that they were in a shelter, but I doubted it. And I couldn't get any more information out of people. The Dutch police wouldn't give me any details about where they were. They told me that initially that they were in the country, but they were very vague, and also they jumped around from point to point. The fact that they weren't helping me, it wouldn't take a report, was highly disturbing to me.
Mm-hmm. So what other communication did you have with Agata after she left?
So on the same day that I received the message that they were in the shelter, I responded and said, Agata, call me. And then 40 minutes later, I said, a few days, Agata, please don't. I need my daughter and she needs me. Talk to me and start talking with someone else like I have been begging you to do. I love you. Later on in that day, I said, Agata, I want us to see someone immediately. Please listen to me about this. It is for our daughter. Please, Agata, I do not care about anything other than taking care of you and Adele. I have been terrified, begging you to talk to someone. Please, I love you. will you go to see the psychologist tomorrow? And I sent another email the next day and said, will you go to see the psychologist, please? So, in the midst of whatever is being told to the police and at some point in the near future, my parents and my family, I am still begging Agata just to get help, just to have our daughter evaluated, and for her to recognize that we had already sought help for what we both believed was a trauma-related disorder, and that it was happening again, and that for the benefit of our daughter, we needed other eyes on this. That we needed professional help by people who understand complex trauma.
So, what else happened with the police and your attempts to get help through them?
So after my first contact with the police, I immediately contacted the U.S. Embassy, but they told me there was nothing they could do because it was out of their jurisdiction. So I went back to the Dutch police several more times, and I was put in contact with a Dutch detective, and I was trying to convince him to evaluate my daughter. I wrote to him on December 29th and said, my daughter was abused and I believe also sexually abused. My wife is for certain a victim of sexual and psychological abuse. You people can shoot me or waterboard me, whatever you please. All I want, at least for now, is to prevent my daughter from leaving the country until this is taken seriously. Please, can I get some help for what I believe is the sexual and psychological abuse of my 4-year-old daughter? And this detective was unresponsive to my claims of abuse. He told me that they could not investigate such abuse on a child below the age of 4. Of course, my daughter was about to be 4, but she wasn't 4 yet. On December 31st, he responded to me, Ian, we send a SMS to your wife's cell phone to contact us. We don't know where she is now. So at this point, after they had been telling me she's in the country, she's safe, they're safe, now I get this email that says they don't know where she is. And so everything that I had been saying for the previous 4 or 5 days about them leaving the country, now I was pretty sure that regardless of where they might have been, they were now not in the country anymore.
Mm-hmm. It's so awful. It's so frustrating. And when you say things in the email like, I don't care if you shoot me or waterboard me, I think that can be confusing to people at first. But when I hear that and knowing you, I understand that as I don't care about myself in this situation. I don't care what happens to me. I care only about the safety of my daughter and her getting evaluated and properly looked at so that she can get help and get to safety, like whatever the cost.
Yeah, so I'm aware of what my first wife had told me about the red herring and that the finger was going to be pointed back at me. I didn't know the specifics of the red herring, but I was just kind of throwing it out there that whatever you think, just you have whatever the other story is. Now I'm telling you that my daughter has been being abused in Poland and they're headed back to Poland. My only request is that you stop that from happening and evaluate my daughter now in this country before they get back to Poland. And whatever it is you think about me, that's fine, but put that aside for a moment and think about my daughter and the fact that she's headed back to where I know she's been abused, to where my first wife told me she's being abused because her family's a cult. And so, yeah, like one time when I was at the police department, I put my hands out and said, handcuff me, arrest me, but listen to me and stop the bus. I'm not worried about whatever it is you do to me. I'm only worried about that child leaving this country and going back to her actual abusers.
So I find this email to be really crazy. On the one from December 31st, 8:55 a.m., Agata to you, where she says, "Hi, Iain. I wanted to let you know that Adele and I are doing okay. We are under professional care in recover." I think she meant recovery, and I feel like when you read that from your perspective at the time, it's like, great, they're in recovery, they're getting help. But what you don't know at that time is that she is saying they are in recovery from you. And that's the story that she told everyone. So, how did this is part of the red herring, how did this play out in your family and your loved ones and people that knew you?
Yeah, at that point, like I heard what she told me about the red herring, about the drug psychological criminal histories. I heard her say, "You are a typical abuser." But of course, like I also knew what the truth was. I knew that I had never raised my voice towards my daughter. I would never spank my daughter. And I certainly never hit my wife either. Like the worst that I did to her was to yell at her and call her names. And you know, I'm completely open about that in the book, but more than that never happened. So I didn't know what specifically was being told to other people.
Until later, right?
Right. So no one told me. My parents weren't telling me the truth. They were in contact with my first wife during this entire period, and they were acting as if they weren't. They were acting as if they wanted to get me help with a lawyer to get my daughter back back to a court in the Netherlands. Um, but later, when I after I had been arrested, that's when I had access to the court records. So in January 2011, which was a week after the abduction, I have emails from my family to my first wife and from my first wife to my family indicating that they're talking about me, and that my family believes that I'm the problem, and that my first wife needed to get away from me with our daughter. And of course, that doesn't make sense because all I had been trying to do and was trying to do was get help and get my daughter evaluated. On January 6th, 2011, my mother emailed my first wife and said, "Iain's father told me that you emailed him that you two are safe, and I thank you for that. Iain is frantic, wondering where you are and Adele, who is his life, as you know." On January 7th, 2011, my dad emailed my first wife and said, "Iain has crashed, finally, on the couch and is asleep. I think he has been up since I got here Wednesday a.m. He loves you both so much and doesn't see that he is off in another world. So bizarre. Will there be charges against him which would allow him to enter a hospital here? He will heal much faster if he has you and Adele in his life to get Iain the help he needs." So another email from my dad to my first wife on January 7th. "Iain is still convinced there's a conspiracy to separate you. If we could break his fantasy, he would have a much better chance to return to reality and get help." On January 8th, 2011, my mother wrote to my first wife, "In my opinion, Iain is having a nervous breakdown. He's convinced you've been abducted and are in great danger. I'm sure his mind created that so he doesn't have to cope with reality." On January 9th, my first wife to my mom, "His mental state for a long time now is based on the drugs he has been abusing for the past 15 years. Adele and I went through hell and back that requires very extensive, long-lasting therapy. Adele startles and cries and hides in the corner." My mom replied to that, "In no way do I consider any of this your fault. I'm so happy that you are a strong woman and took care of both yourself and my granddaughter." So my parents immediately ate up the red herring and couldn't realize that all I wanted was an evaluation. But I wanted it to happen in the Netherlands, away from where they had obviously been abused, because I hadn't even had time to abuse them, let alone it just being completely false. Um, I had been away in the United States for 3 months, and when I returned, it was obvious that they had been abused in Poland. And now they were headed back to Poland, and that was ridiculous, but my family thought it was reasonable.
Why did they think it was reasonable? Why did they believe Agate? Why did they not believe you? Because this is such a huge part of the story of why it's been so hard for people to understand your story for so long, is that even your own parents didn't believe you, even though your dad does believe you now. But why at the time did the red herring work against the people closest to you that should know you best?
I think that it had to do with a couple different things. The first thing was that my family had no contact with my family in the Netherlands. Um, so they were hearing things and had their own ideas of what was happening. And when the abduction took place, then I was the one that was frantic. I was the one that wasn't sleeping. I was the one who was talking about things like child abductions and ritual abuse and mind control and Stockholm syndrome and red herring and to
The Catholic Church.
and a lot of other things came up because I was cycling through and wondering what the heck could be happening. I didn't see the whole picture. I knew what my first wife had told me, but yeah, it was a crazy situation for me, and I was so desperate, more desperate than I'd ever been in my entire life, and and not sleeping until I crashed because all I was trying to do was get people to help me, get people to stop my daughter from leaving the country and going back to where I know she had been abused. So I think that from my parents' perspective, they're like they look at me and they think, well, he's not in his right mind. How could he be? And then they talk to my first wife, and she's like, well, yeah, that makes sense because he's done drugs, and this is actually what happened. And she was able to say it in a calm, cool, and collected manner, and just skillfully point the finger back at me. And for them, that was the more reasonable answer. That was more reasonable than what I was claiming and the way that I was acting. And so it was enough to distract my parents and to allow my first wife and our daughter to get back to Poland.
Was there ever a point where where they asked you, Ian, what is going on? Can you explain it to me? Like, you are my son, and I know you, and this is so unusual what's happening here. Did you ever feel like they really listened to you and tried to understand what you were saying?
No, they never listened to me. They never asked me those questions. It was like they were playing both sides of the fence, and of course I didn't know that till later. But once they heard my first wife's story, then their only action of help, quote unquote help, was to try to get me stable. They thought that I was emotionally out of control. Of course, they didn't take into consideration that my daughter had just been stolen from my home, and I had been warned about that for the previous 3 weeks. They wanted me to calm down and go back to work, and they weren't listening to me.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then you flew back to the U.S. They tricked you into getting locked into a psychiatric hospital because they thought you were delusional. But the doctors in the U.S., they were like, no, he has adjustment disorder. He was having a hard time adjusting to his daughter being abducted.
Yeah, my mom and my aunt tricked me into being admitted involuntarily into a psych observation unit, and the next day they were going to let me go because they had no reason to think I was mentally ill. But then my mom and other people contacted the psychiatrist and said, no, we're afraid. We think he might hurt himself. And so they held me for 2 more weeks. And during that 2 weeks, they ruled out delusional disorder and said that I have adjustment disorder because my only point to the psychiatrist was my mother does not know my first wife. She was not in my home. She did not see what happened after the returns from Poland. She did not hear the things that my first wife had been telling me. And what I want is an evaluation of my daughter. And that, by definition, is not a delusion, because you can't prove that what I'm saying is wrong. I lived it. I heard it. There's documentation that shows I was terrified and trying to get help. So what should have happened is an evaluation of my daughter. But the fact that my mother was on the other team and saying, no, 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 he's wrong, had led to me being locked up for 14 days at that point.
Yeah, I don't think it can be emphasized enough how much your mom's stance had an influence over the entire family, the US Embassy, and how everyone perceived you. Like, she set the tone for how people approached you and perceived you. And I do pray that she sees it one day and is willing to learn more about this topic and readdress it. And I pray she knows that there is forgiveness here for sure, but it's not okay to continue in the lies.
Yeah, I agree. There's nothing wrong with being wrong. There's nothing wrong with even making big mistakes. But that's what my mom has been and continues to do, is make big mistakes that have led to me not having my daughter in my life for almost 14 years, led to me not being heard while I was fighting for my daughter. And so I have forgiven her, but she still is hunkering down in those lies that she has accepted and continues to propagate. And I do believe that she will see it at some point, and I just hope that she knows that I forgive her and love her, and that we can move forward, but we will not move forward in the untruth.
So is there anything else that you want to add to give a picture of how the red herring developed in the beginning of this story and the abduction and why it worked?
So that's all that I know about the red herring at that point, and that's all that I know about the red herring until later, when I'm dealing with people in Poland after having been arrested in Poland. I think we can stop for this episode and continue in another part, and because we've explained how the red herring was introduced to me, what my understanding of it was, and how it helped the abduction of my daughter to take place. So in the next episode, what Emily and I will go over is how the red herring developed, how my understanding of it developed, and where it's at today.
And all of this is just to help people learn from Iain's story, so they can be more aware if similar things are happening in their own lives and what this looks like. There are more recent emails from Agata, Iain's first wife, from this year, and so we want to dive into that in the next episode and talk about what is currently happening.
So she's right. The hope is that other people can learn from this story. And the other purpose of doing these videos and of writing this book and of speaking out is because my daughter and her mother are still in the cult to this day, and nobody has taken a look at this. And there's seemingly nobody in this world whose job it is to take a look at such a thing. So that's the hope, other than education, is to free them from this cult.
Yes. Thank you guys so much for listening today and just taking the time to watch and understand this story more. It means a lot. And we're here for any more questions or comments or anything that you want to say. We can be reached at iloveyoulike1@gmail.com, and we will see you next time.
thank you, Emily, for doing this video with me. I look forward to doing many more with you.
My pleasure.